Hello there. In this video, I'm going to analyze an argument for redistribution that I call the Proviso Argument. It's based on the proviso on property acquisition that's a crucial component of many theories of property rights. And I'm going to argue that this argument succeeds in justifying its conclusion. Now, there are many arguments for redistribution that appeal to something other than rights, for instance, that appeal to certain beneficial outcomes. Perhaps redistribution makes society as a whole better off, or improves the position of the worst off, or promotes equality or some other morally important aim. But the most common objections to redistribution, typically made by libertarians and conservatives, involves an appeal to rights. They would claim that redistribution violates people's property rights. And so the merit of this argument is that it's actually a rights-based argument for redistribution. It argues that not only does redistribution not violate property rights, it's actually required by just property rights. Okay, so let's get to the central claim that I'll be defending in this video. And here it is. Private property is justified only if there is redistribution from the very rich. Right? Now, such redistribution can take the form of progressive taxation in order to fund certain beneficial social programs such as universal health care, education, housing, food, etc., right? Things that meet people's basic needs. Or it can take the form of just direct transfers of money, such as universal basic income, welfare, etc. All right? So the important thing is it's claiming that private property is justified only if there is some form of redistribution from the very rich. Now you'll notice the claim is not quite that we should have redistribution. Instead, it's claiming that if private property is justified, then we need to have redistribution. So if you're a proponent of private property, and if this argument succeeds, then you'd better be a proponent of redistribution from the very rich. Okay, so I'm going to get to the argument, and then I'll support each premise, and then I'll consider some objections to the premises and respond to them. All right, so let's look at the argument as a whole first. The Proviso Argument. Premise 1. Private property is justified only if the proviso on property acquisition is satisfied. I'll explain what that means in one moment. Premise 2. The proviso on property acquisition is satisfied only if there is redistribution from the very rich. Conclusion. So, private property is justified only if there is redistribution from the very rich. All right. So, what is the proviso on property acquisition? Well, it's a condition on establishing a private property right over some external resource. Okay, it's a necessary condition. Now, there's typically another condition which has to do with what you need to do on or with the resource. On John Locke's famous theory, he suggested that you mix your labor with the resource to gain ownership over it. Now, the proviso is a different necessary condition. It has to do with ensuring that other people are not significantly harmed by you're excluding them from the resources that you're claiming. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. Now, here we have a valid argument, okay? So the premises entail the conclusion, and the question is, should we accept these premises? So first, I'm going to say a little bit in support of the first premise. Recall that the first premise says, private property is justified only if the proviso on property acquisition is satisfied. So here's the support for the first premise, all right? Any plausible theory of just property rights will include some sort of a proviso on property acquisition. When you go out into the natural world and claim some resource as your private property, you're thereby forcibly excluding everyone else in the world from using it. Okay? Furthermore, you're doing so unilaterally. You didn't go out and get everyone in the world's consent to be excluded from that resource. You just did it. So the question is, how is this justified? Right? Now, the proviso provides a restriction that ensures that others are not harmed too much by being excluded from resources. It makes sure that they have access to the natural world, right, to the commons, so that they can similarly acquire some resources. And it also compensates people for their loss of freedom. Again, when you acquire a private property right over a resource, you thereby destroy everyone else's freedom to access it. When it was unowned, everyone has a right and has the freedom to access it and use it. But once a private property claim is established over it, people lose this freedom. So people need to be compensated. And making sure that they're left with enough resources so they can do the same is the way of making sure to compensate people for this loss, right? Now, just a pair of cases to motivate the idea that there is a proviso, right? We'll call these Desert Island 1 and Desert Island 2, okay? On Desert Island 1, you're on a desert island with some other people, and there are a bunch of coconut trees with coconuts on them, and so you go out and you cut down one of the coconut trees, leaving a whole lot of others there, and you collect some coconuts, again, leaving a whole bunch, and you build a little hut, and you eat some coconuts, and you save some for later. Now, because you've left a bunch of other coconut trees with a bunch of other coconuts, it seems like in this case, you've succeeded in establishing a just private property claim over those resources, right? Someone can't just come along and take them. You've established a private property right over them. Now, on Desert Island 2, suppose you go out and you cut down all of the coconut trees and you collect all of the coconuts, right? Perhaps there's a lot more than you could ever make use of, but you're the one who gets there first and you take them all for yourself. You might think, look, if there are a bunch of other people on this desert island, you actually haven't succeeded in establishing a just claim of private property over all those resources since you haven't satisfied the proviso, right? You haven't left other people with enough resources so that they can do what you did, acquire ownership over their own resources, all right? So insofar as you find this pair of cases plausible, that in the first case you succeed in acquiring a private property right over the resources, and in the second case you haven't, and the difference being in the second case you haven't left enough for others, then I think you should accept some sort of a proviso on property acquisition. Okay? Now, the second premise says the proviso on property acquisition is satisfied only if there is redistribution from the very rich. Okay? Now, the support for this premise is this. Without redistribution, people born into the world with no resources, apart from themselves and their labor, can be completely excluded from external resources and left without compensation for their loss of freedom. And who's excluding people from the most resources? Well, the very rich, right? So redistribution is the only way to make sure that other people are not excluded completely from all external resources, and it's also a way of compensating people for their loss of freedom, okay? And it has to be from the very rich because they're the ones doing the most excluding, okay? They're the ones destroying the most people's freedom to access resources. Okay, so let's look at the argument once again. We have private property is justified only if the proviso on property acquisition is satisfied. The proviso on property acquisition is satisfied only if there is redistribution from the very rich. Conclusion, so private property is justified only if there is redistribution from the very rich. So again, this is a valid argument, so the only way to challenge it is to challenge one of the two premises. So if you want to rationally deny the conclusion, you're going to have to deny a premise, okay? So how might we challenge the first premise, which again says, private property is justified only if the proviso on property acquisition is satisfied? Well, the proviso is by definition the necessary condition that must be satisfied to establish a claim of private property rights, right? It's a condition that has to do with leaving other people with enough resources so they can do the same. And so the only way to deny this premise is to deny that there is a proviso, right? In other words, you need to claim there is no such proviso on property acquisition. Now, presumably the objection shouldn't just stop there. It should say a little bit more to try to make this plausible, okay? So one thing you might say is perhaps unrestricted property acquisition is simply just, right? Perhaps there's simply nothing wrong with going out and establishing claims of property rights over resources and doing so over and over as much as you like. Perhaps there's simply no restrictions, okay? Now, I just don't find this very plausible, okay? It's sort of whoever gets there first gets the private property and everyone else is shit out of luck, doesn't seem like a very plausible theory of just property rights, okay? Maybe you could say a little bit more to defend this claim that there is no such proviso. Maybe instead you could say, look, it'd be nice if there could be such a proviso, but any plausible proviso would be impossible to satisfy, right? So I think in the Lockean version, it said something like, you need to leave enough and as good for others. You might worry, look, strictly speaking, you can't leave exactly as good for others, since by establishing a private property right over some object, you thereby are removing everyone else's freedom to access that very object, right? Even if you collect only a single coconut from this desert island and leave plenty of other coconut trees and coconuts for others, suppose someone happens to want that very coconut. They no longer have access to it, so it's impossible to leave people with exactly as good, right? But I think this is simply not that plausible a proviso. I think there are plenty of provisos that are possible to satisfy, and of all of these, surely some of them are plausible, right? Surely there are some provisos which say, okay, you don't need to leave exactly the same amount of resources or leave people in exactly the same position you were in, but you do need to leave them enough, okay? And I think provisos like this can be satisfied, in particular through redistribution, but I think it's just not very plausible to deny that there's a proviso at all, okay? So I think the objections to this premise don't succeed. What about this second premise? This premise says the proviso on property acquisition is satisfied only if there's redistribution from the very rich, okay? So this premise grants that there's a proviso and says, look, there's only one way to satisfy it, redistribution from the very rich, all right? So to object to this premise, you might say, look, I grant that there's a proviso, but there are other ways it can be satisfied, all right? So how might you go on to say that? You might say, look, property owners can invest, produce, spend, etc. in a way that benefits all, okay? And by doing so, that's how they satisfy the proviso. Now, I simply think this is just not good enough, okay? You can't just offer people resources with strings attached, such as hire them for a job, and then they have to do what you say, and only then will you pay them. You owe people compensation for excluding them from resources. So it cannot be voluntary, right? It's not just that if you're feeling nice, you offer people a job or you offer them a product they can buy. You need to give people something in order to compensate them for their loss of freedom. Okay, so I don't think this is good enough. You might instead object, look, the proviso is automatically satisfied since there are still unowned resources out there, right? Surely, there are some parts of Antarctica that are unowned, some parts of the wilderness, maybe in the middle of the ocean, etc. So, no need for the very rich to pay anything as long as there are still unowned resources out there. Now, I think this doesn't work, and I'll try to defend that by analogy. I think if you're on the desert island and you claimed all of the coconut trees for yourself and all the coconuts, when other people come along needing resources, I don't think it's good enough to say, look, you can swim out through the treacherous waters, and I'm sure you'll find some unowned resources out there. I don't think in doing that, the proviso has been satisfied, okay? You're excluding people from resources on that desert island, right? And so you need to leave people enough so that they can do what you did, right? So by analogy, the rich are unilaterally excluding people from resources within civilization, and they owe it to others to compensate them for their loss of freedom, okay? They need to leave them resources that are almost as good, right? They can't just say, go take a piece of Antarctica, it's all yours. They need to leave them resources that are almost as good, okay? That brings us to the last objection. It could be claimed that the proviso only applies to the original appropriators, not the later recipients, right? We've been talking about someone going out into nature and claiming some resource as their private property, and in doing that, they need to satisfy the proviso. They need to make sure to leave others with enough and compensate them for their loss of freedom. But most of the property that's owned today wasn't acquired like this. Instead, it was acquired through transfers, right? At some point down the line, it was originally appropriated, but instead it got to where it was by a series of just transfers. Now, this is obviously an oversimplification or an approximation, since clearly there have been injustices that have taken place along the way. But even ignoring that, I think there's a way of responding to this objection. First of all, the motivation for the proviso applies to property acquisition in general, not just original appropriation, right? When you acquire property, whether that's by taking some part of the natural world as your own or being transferred property from other people, you're still excluding people from using those resources. And you still need to compensate people for their lack of freedom to access those resources, right? Furthermore, even if we grant that the proviso only applies to original appropriation, we need to remember that the recipient's current claim being just depends on the original appropriations being just, right? The way these theories of property rights work is your claim is just only if you acquired it justly. And you acquired it justly only if you either appropriated it from nature, satisfying the proviso, or were justly transferred it from its prior owner. And that claim is only just if the prior owner had a just claim to it. So on and so forth, all the way back until when the resource was originally appropriated from nature, right? There's no bit of owned matter that's just created ex nihilo. Every bit of owned matter was once originally appropriated from nature. And so the proviso must be satisfied by the original appropriators. They must leave enough for others. And if they don't satisfy it, then the claim down the line is not just. So in order for the original appropriation to be just, either the appropriators themselves need to satisfy the proviso or the recipients down the line need to satisfy it. And so that's why I think the very rich, who control vast amounts of resources, need to compensate people for their loss of freedom to access these resources, right? Somewhere down the line, these resources were taken from the commons, and so people need to be compensated for no longer having access to these commons. And so, looking at the argument one final time, premise 1, private property is justified only if the proviso on property acquisition is satisfied. Premise 2, the proviso on property acquisition is satisfied only if there is redistribution from the very rich. So, private property is justified only if there is redistribution from the very rich. So, when people object to redistribution by claiming that it violates property rights, I think a good response is to say, not only does redistribution not violate property rights, it's actually required by property rights. And to not have redistribution is actually a violation of people's rights. Okay? And so I think this argument is pretty compelling. It's a valid argument with plausible premises, and so I find this conclusion to be pretty plausible. But if you don't, if you think you have some way of rejecting one of these premises, then I wish you good fortune in the culture wars to come. And now it begins.